In October of 1913, President Woodrow Wilson sat down and signed a law that on paper was almost impossible to notice. A modest tax, just 1%, aimed only at the wealthiest households in the country. The exemption was set so high that fewer than 4 out of every 100 American families would ever owe a cent. It was sold as a small correction, a way to make the industrial titans of the Gilded Age pay something closer to their share, while everyone else went on with their lives exactly as before. 2 months later, on December 23rd, Wilson signed a second law, creating an entirely new institution to manage the nation's money supply. 2 laws, 1 calendar year, 1 president's signature, and together, they quietly built the financial machinery that still runs your paycheck more than a century later. Most people who've heard of the income tax assume it simply grew over time, the way any tax naturally rises with inflation and changing politics. What almost nobody realizes is how deliberately these 2 laws were built to work together from the very beginning, and how fast the promise attached to the first one collapsed once the ink was dry. To understand why 1913 mattered so much, you have to go back further, to a country that had survived its first 124 years, almost entirely on tariffs. There was no income tax, no April deadline, no annual ritual of receipts and forms. The Constitution itself made a national income tax nearly impossible to administer, requiring any direct tax to be apportioned among the states by population, a technical wall that reformers spent decades trying to knock down. A brief wartime income tax during the Civil War proved the public would accept a direct tax on earnings if it was wrapped in the language of national emergency, but Congress let it expire in 1872, and the idea went dormant. It didn't stay dormant for long. The Gilded Age produced a class of industrial fortunes with no historical precedent: Rockefeller's oil monopoly, Carnegie's steel empire, Morgan's sprawling financial network, while the tariff system that funded the federal government fell disproportionately on ordinary consumers, since tariffs raised the price of everyday goods far more than they touched the wealth of men who could simply absorb the cost. By the 1890s, populist anger over this imbalance was boiling, and in 1894, Congress passed a modest flat income tax. The Supreme Court struck it down within a year, ruling it unconstitutional without a formal amendment. For the next 14 years, the idea simmered, until President Taft, hoping to kill the movement for a generation by letting it fail in the state legislatures, sent a constitutional amendment to the states in 1909. He miscalculated badly. On February 3, 1913, Wyoming became the 36th state to ratify what became the 16th Amendment, just 17 words granting Congress the power to tax incomes from any source, without apportionment. Now here is where the story picks up speed, in a way that looking back feels less like ordinary legislative process and more like a coordinated construction project. Weeks after that ratification, Wilson was inaugurated on a platform of tariff reform. Within months, the Revenue Act of 1913 slashed average tariffs and replaced the lost government revenue with the new graduated income tax, a top rate of just 7%, reaching only the very wealthiest households. And then, less than 3 months later, on December 23rd, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, creating America's first true central bank. A brand new income tax and a brand new central bank, both established within the same calendar year, designed, whether by explicit coordination or simple necessity, to function together. The income tax gave the federal government an open-ended claim on the earnings of its citizens. The Federal Reserve gave a new institution the power to manage the money supply and, when needed, to help the government finance debt at a scale the old tariff system never could have supported. For the first few years, the promise held. In 1913, fewer than 4% of families owed anything at all. The original tax form was 3 pages long. Total revenue collected in that first year came to roughly $71 million, a rounding error next to what tariffs still brought in. For the average American, nothing had changed. Then came the war. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, Congress needed money fast, and the top marginal rate, which had started at 7%, jumped to 67% within a single year, then to 77% the year after that. Exemptions were lowered, pulling millions more households into the tax base for the first time. When the war ended, rates did come down, but they never returned to where they started. This became the pattern that defined the tax for the rest of the century. Every emergency justified an expansion. Every peace that followed reversed only part of it. By the Second World War, the income tax had been transformed from what historians call a class tax into a mass tax, with the top rate reaching an almost unimaginable 94%, and crucially, with the introduction of automatic payroll withholding in 1943, a wartime innovation sold as a patriotic convenience that quietly outlived the war it was built for. Withholding changed everything about how the tax actually felt. Before 1943, Americans wrote checks and felt the money leave their accounts. After withholding, the tax vanished before it ever reached your hands, deducted automatically from every paycheck. You never mourn what you never held, and the system that emerged from 1913 became, for most working Americans, close to invisible. It's worth being careful here. This isn't a story about a secret plot to enslave the middle class in taxation. The progressive reformers of 1913 were responding to genuinely unfair conditions, an economy where industrial monopolists paid almost nothing, while ordinary consumers absorbed the cost of tariffs on every purchase they made. Their diagnosis of the problem was largely correct. But the amendment they wrote contained no rate limits, no permanent exemption floor, and no expiration date, a blank check with no ceiling, left entirely to the discretion of whichever Congress happened to be sitting when the next crisis arrived. And every crisis since 1913 has cashed that check for a little more than the one before it. Wilson himself understood exactly what he was building. He deliberately kept the first exemptions high, knowing the tax would be unpopular, and let future Congresses expand it as the moment demanded. The lawmakers who voted for the light, narrow tax of 1913 were the same lawmakers who, 5 years later, voted for a version more than 10 times as heavy. They were not surprised by the growth. In a very real sense, they were its architects. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden financial history behind the headlines is what you come here for, consider subscribing to the discount window. New videos every week.